they're not getting a lot of cases in schools.
Yeah, West Hill is way better than. We're delighted to share what we think is interesting here in Central New York with people all over. And we're especially excited to have Gillian Martin here today because she's the founder of Cavity Conservation Initiative. And this is an organization that I came across a number of years ago, just surfing the internet, and I was just so impressed at the resources provided and the rationale and so on. I've just admired this organization so much. And it's a Southern California, from Southern California, and the mission is to protect habitat for cavity nesting birds and other wildlife that rely on dead trees. She's also the co-founder of Tree Care for Birds and Other Wildlife program, which is a committee of the Western chapter of the International Society of Arboriculture. And of course, a passionate naturalist and environmental activist striving to build partnerships between diverse interest groups. Her articles have been published in numerous professional journals and newsletters, and we're really happy to have her here talking to us today. So Gillian, you'd like to get started?
Yes, Janet, thank you so much. I've been so excited about joining you today. So thank you for being here. I'm going to just share my screen here. Share. There we go. Let me move this over. And we're going to go. Okay. Can you see that? Can you all see my screen?
I can certainly see it, and I guess I should tell people if they go up, for me it's the top right corner of my screen. You get some choices for view, and the view I have is side-by-side speaker. That seems to work best. And if anyone can't see the screen, just unmute yourself and say so, but I'm assuming we all can.
Okay, terrific. Thanks, John. So, you know, Janet, I was so delighted to visit your website and to see what an ambassador you are for dead trees. And I assume that some of those in the audience have already been to your website and have learned much about what I'm going to talk about today just by visiting your wonderful site. But I'm really hoping to just generally enhance everyone's appreciation of this natural resource, the habitat value of dead trees, in the hope that, you know, as you go about your daily lives, maybe your antenna will be a little higher looking for dead trees, perhaps having an interest in making observations about them, looking for signs of wildlife that might be using them. And whenever it's appropriate, right tree, right place, you might want to advocate for the safe retention of dead trees if in fact you think they may be slated for removal. So, okay, so I just want to review with you what I'm going to talk about in the next hour. I have a lot to go through, but so you have a sense of what's coming. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the historical role of dying and dead trees. You know, that is what sort of Mother Nature had in mind for trees before humans came along and changed the landscape. And then I really want to spend a fair amount of time talking about the pivotal role played by woodpeckers, because we can't talk about dead trees and their habitat value without spending some time understanding the role of woodpeckers, how important they are to the ecosystems in which they reside. And then, of course, I'm going to expand from woodpeckers to go on to talk about other wildlife and their associations with dead trees. And the very practical part of the presentation, about the last half of it, or are the considerations when selecting and managing a habitat tree for wildlife. So I like to begin with this slide because it shows a tree's habitat value over time and sort of dispels the general myth that trees lose value, and especially habitat value, when they start to decline. So this yellow, marking line all the way across is right away signals, because we're illustrating the habitat value over time from this bar here. So it really signals that the habitat value of trees don't just plummet when a tree starts to do this, right? It continues. And that is because, nature designed trees to have two lives, actually. One when they're growing and healthy and mature, and another one commences when the tree starts to decline. And there are actually a whole suite of organisms that benefit from dead wood and trees in distress and declining trees. And some of them, are specifically there to benefit trees in different stages of decline, so that when we remove a tree down to the stump, let's say when it starts to do like this one, like the middle tree, we actually deprive the tree of its commendable destiny, its whole second life. And in drier climates like we are out in the West, it can take some trees hundreds of years to die, especially our old oaks. So think about the habitat value that we're removing when we deprive the tree for fulfilling its natural destiny. But of course, I'm aware that in natural forest systems, the amount of wildlife that can benefit from dead trees is much greater. In our urban forests, we may not have the number of ecological inputs as those in natural forests. So I'm talking here primarily about when trees die in the natural forest. But even in urban forests, where the habitat is healthy, the ecological benefits of these trees can be enormous. So some of the organisms that are there to nature designed to cull weak trees, their role is really to get them ready for their final resting place, which is soil, right? But to help break them down. And so some of these organisms are things that you might not think about in everyday life. And that is, there are bark and wood boring beetles. There are clear-winged boring moths, wood wasps, termites, and flies. All of these play this role. But before I want to leave this slide, I want to just bring your eye to these holes in the bark of this tree. These are what we think of as wood-boring beetle exit holes. The beetles go into generally the cambium of the tree when it's distressed, and they nest in there. And when the young go through all their instars and reach adulthood and are ready to leave the tree, they make these exit holes. And these exit holes can be really, really tiny and perfectly round, like the tip of a pen. They can be larger, D-shaped, they can be oval, and maybe some other shapes as well. But the reason I'm bringing your attention to this now is that my general impression is that beetle exit holes, the circumference of them is very smooth. You notice that? And so I want you just to kind of keep that in the front of your memory, because later on, I'm going to draw your attention to what a woodpecker foraging hole looks like, so you can distinguish between the two. All right, so in addition to all the organisms that help break down trees, the insects and so on, we have, as saprophytic fungi that is there. They're there to break down dead and decaying matter, which includes, of course, trees that are declining, and to also give them back to the soil. But what I have really been delighted to learn is about all the insects, and I don't know them specifically, that actually benefit from what we could think of as mushrooms, the fruiting bodies of fungi that we see on dead wood, even down wood on the ground, and sometimes even in the soil. But there are apparently insects, these look like little flies. There are insects that specialize in eating the fruiting bodies of fungi, and there are others that bore into these mushrooms and nest in there. And then there are others, predatory types, that come in to eat, prey on those nesting inside the fruiting bodies. I just think that's just awesome. And of course, you can appreciate the spiders come along, knowing that insects are coming and going from these fruiting bodies, and sling their webs under these fruiting bodies to catch the insects, right? And then maybe your ruby-throated hummingbird would come along and in the spring and pull some of these this webbing from the spider's web and weave it into her nest to give it elasticity and strength. So, here is just one little organism that is serving so many others. And this is what I love about nature, right? very often there are many values to even a single aspect of nature. So obviously decay occurs in trees that are often declining, and sometimes we don't see the decay at all because it occurs in the heartwood. But when decay forms and makes cavities on the exterior of trunks or limbs, where we're very grateful for them, and particularly when the cavities are large because they serve large cavity nesting birds like the barn owl, and even some small mammals will den or roost or seek cover inside these cavities. But cavities also occur, as I just said, in places we can't see, and for instance, sometimes in a large limb of a tree. And it's only when the tree care provider comes along and makes that cut to remove that dead limb, usually for safety reasons, that it exposes that rot, that decay, for which other organisms can benefit from. And this here is the European starling, which I'm sure is a non-native bird, but here, very opportunistically took advantage of this cavity that's exposed by the tree care provider's work. But many other organisms, cavity nesting birds, will take advantage of these exposed cavities. And of course, cavities form at the boles of trees that you obviously benefit. They can be dens for wildlife and shelter and so on. But woodpeckers, of course, make their own cavities. I don't know of a woodpecker that would use a natural cavity, but exceptions always occur in nature. But we call woodpeckers primary excavators because they are really mostly the only birds that can actually excavate cavities in wood, in sometimes living wood, but often in dead wood. These birds have a very unique biology. They're my second favorite topic to talk about, woodpeckers. And they are designed specifically for a life clinging to trees in an upright position and for doing this excavation. So, I mean, can you imagine what it takes for this small bird to be banging sometimes for weeks at a time in wood to excavate a cavity without getting a concussion, and then spitting all the wood chips out, right, as it goes along? And why, we wonder, don't these wood chips get in their eyes, get in up their nostrils, up in their ears? And there are all kinds of special adaptations to protect woodpeckers while they're doing this hazardous work. I think they're fascinating organisms, and I hope to enhance your appreciation of them even more as we go ahead. So here, you'll recognize this bird. This is the Downy Woodpecker nesting in a cavity in our area. His mom, and quickly follows dad with a bill full of insects. So these are the delightful scenes that we miss sometimes when we don't spend time observing dead trees. Whoops, I just want to go ahead. All right, so there are about 80 cavity nesting birds in North America, and of that 80, 20 are woodpeckers. So we call them the carpenters of the bird world. And, one scientific study has revealed, answered a question I've wanted to answer for a long time, that woodpeckers provide about 77% of the nesting cavities used by non-excavators. So what we think of as the secondary cavity nesters. And so you're going to really appreciate what an important role woodpeckers play in the ecosystems in which they live. They're actually creating real estate for nesting for many, many other organisms, and not just birds, by the way. So I did a little poking around, and I found, I hope this is accurate, in the state of New York, you have 7 primary cavity nesters. That means woodpeckers, and 22 secondary cavity nesters. So secondary cavity nesters are ducks. We have 7 species in North America that nest in cavities in trees. We have 10 owls, 2 falcons, and 40 songbirds. So this, this is really a wonderful illustration of the future of cavity nesting birds with or without the work of woodpeckers. So we really need to support their trees so woodpeckers can do their work, and therefore secondarily support all the others that benefit from their cavities. So in your area, I don't know how much you might get the pileated woodpecker. Maybe they're further up in forests, not quite in your urban areas, but you have the lovely red-headed woodpecker, which we don't have in the West. And then you have the red-bellied woodpecker. And then you have the yellow shafted flicker. In the west, we have the northern flicker, which is red shafted. And the flicker is our only terrestrial woodpecker, does most of its foraging for food on the ground. Talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Then you have the Downy Woodpecker, which we just saw. And you also have the hairy woodpecker, which is its relative, just a little bit larger, most distinguished by its much longer bill, a heavier excavator than the Downy woodpecker. So these are the primary cavity nesters that are identified in your area. And there's an example of your secondary cavity nesters. You have the screech owls, you have the black-capped chickadee, and also the Carolina chickadee. You have the white-breasted nuthatch and the red-breasted nuthatch. And you have 3 wrens. You have the Carolina wren, the winter wren, and the house wren. And then you have the eastern bluebird, and you have the prothonotary warbler, and the tufted titmouse. So there are your cavity nesters. But so back to woodpeckers. So you understand really well now how important woodpeckers are in terms of creating cavities that allow other birds to breed. But woodpeckers have other values as well. They actually reduce insects in our environment from all areas of an ecosystem. And they do this by what we call habitat partitioning. You can ignore that term. What it really means is that woodpeckers, different species, tend to specialize, but not strictly so, in foraging for insects in different areas of a landscape. So that there are woodpeckers that do a lot of what we call aerial foraging. They pluck insects in flight from midair. They usually do so by perching on a tree or a dead tree, particularly where the view is good and they catch the insects going by. There are others that forage on insects just on the surface of bark or behind loose bark. This is very common of your Downy woodpecker. In our state, it would be the Nuttall's woodpecker. Then there are others that bore into wood to the cambium, like the hairy woodpecker, and go after the beetle grubs that are in there. And of course, the pileated woodpecker goes after the carpenter ants that are deep inside wood. And then we have the northern flicker, which forages in the soil, subterranean ant nests and beetle nests and so on. So you can see, and also there are some woodpeckers that pluck insects from the foliage of trees. So you can see they're going after insects in almost any place where insects exist. And of course, we understand now that when insect outbreaks occur in our forests, woodpeckers become first responders. And because of that, some scientists think that woodpeckers may actually be extending the life of infested trees. But what I want to point out here is that when woodpeckers pull the bark off trees to expose what we call the beetle galleries, this is where the grubs are, right? You notice all these little squiggly lines. These are the little galleries that are made by the grubs as they go through different instars and mature, and they're eating the wood. Sometimes beetles bring in fungi and farm the fungi behind the bark for the insects to eat, but that varies depending on the beetle species. But when woodpeckers do this, pull away the bark, they're not only benefiting from the grubs that are there, but they're exposing that whole nest site, which enable other insectivorous birds and wildlife to benefit from that. They would normally have access to these beetle grubs. So woodpeckers are doing that for other organisms as well. And of course, so is the northern flicker, right? The red-shafted flicker. When it's exposing all these ant nests and beetle nests on the ground, they're exposing those sources of prey for other organisms. And then the sapsuckers, which you undoubtedly know are also woodpeckers, go around drilling holes, sap holes, right, in living trees. They don't do this in dead trees, obviously, because the sap is gone by then. But they do this to feed themselves, to drink the sap. But in the process, look at what's happening. There are a whole bunch of organisms that benefit from the sap wells that woodpeckers make. I mean, I can't even identify all the species here, but we have ants and we have flies and we have, I think, wasps and so many. And in addition to that, butterflies will drink from these sap wells. Rodents will, other birds will. Even deer and bear are known to drink from sap wells if the sap wells are within their height. So you know, I always say woodpeckers make great neighbors because they provide so many ecological benefits to the organisms within their habitat. And that's why we call woodpeckers keystone species, because where they exist, many other species can exist as well and enrich the diversity of the habitat. But we're not quite done with woodpeckers. So woodpeckers are what we call agents of forest succession. And they're not the only ones, but by that, what we're talking about is the fact that, you know, because woodpeckers are hitching up and down trees and coming in contact with the mushrooms, right? The fungal spores from the mushrooms are brushing up against the woodpecker's chests, on their feet, on their bills, on their heads. And as the woodpeckers move around on that tree or into other trees that are distressed, they're transporting those fungal spores and therefore helping to break down trees. They're helping the fungi do its job, but they're also helping their own purpose, which is helping the trees to decay so they can make cavities in there, right? But other organisms that brush up against fungi are also vectors of fungal spores and help become agents of forest succession, because in an ideal habitat, we want young trees, we want mature trees, living healthy trees, and we want trees in all stages of decay, like you saw in the very first slide I showed. But I want to point out that it's not just cavity nesting birds that benefit from the insects that occupy dead trees. Hummingbirds do, and your hummingbird certainly does. And this is one of ours. I think it's very hard to tell from this photo, but I think this is probably an Anna's hummingbird, but you don't have that in your ear. But you can see where the long bill is very suitable for probing behind loose bark and just plucking insects off of bark. But of course, hummingbirds pluck insects from midair as well, because they feed their young almost when they're raising, a nest, feeding them almost exclusively insects. But you also have a wonderful warbler, the black and white warbler, that it forages mostly on dead wood, and standing dead trees and on down wood. This bird forages a bit like nuthatches do. So this lovely warbler would take care of would benefit from your dead trees as well. But one of the most unappreciated values of dead trees is the fact that they provide unobstructed views. And I know you have seen hawks and other birds at the tippy top of trees. Birds, especially in the nesting season, want those unobstructed views. And of course, dead trees provide that because they usually have very little or no foliage, right? So these dead trees provide perches for hunting, for territorial defense, for courtship, and for capturing insects in flight. So let's think about this. You know, the bird that gets to keep its territory, right, gets to keep all the resources in it, and the bird that gets the girl gets its genes passed on. So the advantage that dead trees provide is that it gives birds the benefit of seeing who's in their territory and who may be threatening their position in their territory, or who may be getting the girl that they're after. All right, so the unobstructed views, the benefit of them are also illustrated here when flocking birds, in this case, these are cliff swallows, during migration, they act as staging sites for birds as they take off for migration, and also resting sites for flocks. And what this allows, this unobstructed view allows is for members of the flock to monitor the foraging success of other members. So they benefit by seeing who is successful at coming back with prey or finding the right food or prey, and who is not. So can't underestimate the value of unobstructed views. But dead trees, because the wood is softened, right? They provide the perfect place for storing food for the winter. Birds store, here we have a white-breasted nuthatch storing some sort of a nut in a cranny here, but they're not the only ones that do this. Even small mammals do, right? And other birds store seeds and nuts and insects and fruits and berries and even some vegetation for the winter. Sometimes these food stores really determine who makes it through the harsh winter or not. And on the West Coast where I live, we have this wonderful woodpecker. You may be familiar with it. The Acorn Woodpecker gets its name from the fact that they pluck acorns from trees, not from the ground, and they make holes just right for each acorn, plug them in there, and there can be thousands and thousands of acorns stored by this family. Tends to live in large family groups, and this is what supports them primarily through the winter. We call them acorn granaries. But dead trees are also useful as anvils for birds, because when the top of a tree falls off, or let's say some decay occurs in a branch and makes a little depression, well, the birds use them for cracking open nuts and seeds, cracking open the exoskeletons of insects, right, to take them to their young. So their trees provide this wonderful opportunity for birds to break up and access some of their food sources. So what you've just heard is the drumming sound of the Downy Woodpecker. This is a Downy Woodpecker. This is a male. And woodpeckers, don't have vocal cords that allow them to sing. They do make many different types of vocalizations, but they cannot sing. And one of their primary ways of defending their territory or impressing a mate is to drum on trees. Now, they will drum on man-made objects when they know that object will make a loud noise, but they prefer dead trees because the sound resonates farther. And so, who knew, right, to think about dead trees in this way? Dead trees are a substrate for communication between woodpeckers. But stress cracks, as I'm sure you've seen in living trees, but they also, of course, occur in, dead trees have them. These stress cracks are wonderful spots for wildlife to roost and to nest. Some of your wrens will nest in here, especially that house wren will nest almost anywhere. They nest in these stress cracks, and for snakes and lizards to thermoregulate there as well. The photographer who took this picture and shared it with me, I was, bless his heart, I've never seen such a great picture. It pointed out that these are brown creepers, and I can only see 3 here, but he told me there are actually 4 brown creepers nesting together, huddling together in the stress crack in the winter. And he says he's seen this stress crack in this dead tree used year after year by the brown creepers. And of course, isn't it obvious that dead bits and pieces of dead wood are used by raptors in particular for building their large stick nests, which they add to year after year, and sometimes inherited by other wildlife that need large stick nests but can't make their own. All right, so I focused on birds because that's primarily my area of interest, and I'm more knowledgeable about birds, but there are a whole bunch of mammals that I'm not as familiar with that you benefit from dead trees and down wood as well. The black bear, the gray fox in your area, the American martin, the fisher. Some of these are forest dwelling organisms, the raccoons, fox squirrel. You have a flying squirrel in your region that breeds in cavities in trees. Many times the flying squirrels benefit from the cavities that woodpeckers make. You have a little brown bat that nests in cavities, and of course many rodents use cavities in standing dead trees and down wood as well. And the Zerker Society tells us that 30% of native bees species nest in tree cavities. This looks like a tree that was struck by lightning, but of course they might be in stress cracks or cavities as well. The bees will nest in them. And I can't leave that portion of the subject without talking about the habitat value of down wood. It is obvious that reptiles would like to bask in the sun to warm their bodies up at certain times of the year, but they also use them as camouflage, right? But they also know that they'll find insect prey associated or rodent prey associated with down wood. So it's a great place to be foraging for food as well. But dead trees, when they're down wood, when they're left on the landscape, provide a number of great services. They trap leaf litter, right, which keeps moisture in the ground, gives cover for wildlife, for soil organisms. Also traps snow, right, which slows the runoff of slow and slows runoff in periods, so the nutrients from the ground are not lost through runoff. And when we leave dead logs that have decay in them in our landscape, those also provide shelter from the elements and from predators. And I think to say this because we live in a very hot climate, right? Where the inside of these logs can be very, very hot, not very habitable. So generally we recommend that dead logs be put in partially shaded areas and parallel to land contours for the same reason that we suggest putting other logs parallel to contours to save the runoff and so on. And if you're so inclined to kind of partially bury them, as nature would allow to happen over time. Also helps them decay. But I can't stress enough the value of logs just leaning over streams or leaning over a body of water, or actually laying across a creek, because these are places obviously where ducks can rest, get out of the water for a while. These are fishing platforms for egrets and herons and raccoons to reach into the water to get prey. They are also transportation corridors from one bank to the other, allow organisms to migrate from one part of the habitat through others. So a down log in water or adjacent to water is really, really very helpful habitat. So need I say, in nature, nothing is superfluous, but I know you guys know that already. So, okay, so I'm going to get into the more practical side of this content by, pointing out that, in developed areas, because we've changed the land so much, we've had to change the rules about that apply to the management of dead trees. And so historically, this is what we do here. We cut them down to the stump. And of course, sometimes that's absolutely necessary. But I got a little crazy with the underlining here, but this is one of the main points I want to see. And I underline words that have special meaning. And so what we're saying is that some trees, not all trees, the dead trees, in suitable locations, meaning they're not suitable for all locations, can be managed for safety, because most of the time in urban areas where we live, they have to be managed for safety, and can be retained for a time. And I stress a time because all trees will fail eventually, partially, or sometimes all at once, by a sudden event. So in the cases where trees cannot be allowed to just die completely in place and collapse whenever they need to, we always recommend a tree risk assessment qualified arborist to evaluate that tree, to make recommendations about, how long it's going to stand, what could be done to retain that tree, to take the weight of that tree to allow it to stand in place for a while. They particularly would be interested in the root structure of that tree and how compromised it is. And anyway, the place to find a tree risk assessment qualified arborist in your region is to go to treesaregood.com. All right, so I have 4 handouts available to you today with what John will make available to you if he hasn't already. And one is what we call a wildlife habitat hazardous tree decision model. And this gives some step-by-step thoughts or decisions that allow arborists in particular, but lay people as well, to consider options for a dead tree other than removing it down to the ground. This other handout is called How to Protect Wildlife Before Removing a Dead Tree, because obviously in the nesting season, if there are cavities there may be birds nesting in that cavity. And even outside of the nesting season, there may be birds or wildlife roosting or hibernating or seeking shelter in there. So before we move any dead tree, there are certain things we should do, and these handouts elaborate on some of that guidance for you. There are obviously some places where where trees should not be retained, but an arborist call these trees hazardous trees, and this is their definition of a hazardous tree. And that is a tree that has been assessed and found likely to fail and cause unacceptable degree of injury, damage, or disruption, thereby posing a high or extreme risk. And the targets that they're particularly concerned about are people, structures, and activities that we might disrupt. So obviously a dead tree on a busy roadway, right, and adjacent to homes is not likely to be a tree that one would advocate for. Also, we would not likely advocate for a dead tree like in your central park where lots of people recreate, because the risk there is likely to be too great. In some cases, people have against they're in their own personal property, a dead tree there, and that is a possibility. This is just a walkway here, not a street, that's where we would want to bring in a tree risk assessment qualified arborist, and the homeowner and the arborist can decide, what can be done to save this tree. So in some cases, trees against property can be safely retained, but that is where we really need to, consult somebody who knows a lot about assessing risk to our property and to other people that might be passing by. So I actually have a new handout. You're the first to receive it. And it's titled, What Makes a Good Snag? And a consulting arborist and myself work together, produces, I think we'll probably improve it still, but this is some really good guidance to add to what I've already shared about how to go about, selecting a dead tree. And I'm not quite done with that topic, but that's the third handout I have for you. And then there'll be one more I'm going to mention at the end. So when we go looking for a dead tree to retain, one of the first things I do, I not only look at the context in which that tree is dying, talk more about that in a minute, but I look for signs of wildlife that using that tree. And I'm particularly interested in looking for signs of woodpecker use, because woodpeckers are the only species that leave a record of their work. And the record of their work looks something like this: cavities, right? And they're very fond of making cavities below dead limbs, where the dead limbs, join the trunk. But they will make cavities on the underside of dead limbs as well. So look for cavities. Look for what we call woodpecker starts. So woodpeckers obsessive excavators, and they go around testing trees all the time to see how soft the wood is, to see which would be a good place to actually excavate a full cavity. But so many times they do this, they test the tree in different places and they go off, and sometimes they don't come back, but sometimes they do. If they continue to live and survive in that area, they may come back and keep checking that tree and eventually make a full cavity and nest in that tree. So look for woodpecker starts, and then look for woodpecker foraging holes. Do you remember, I think it was the second slide or something I showed you, and it said, make a note of the smooth circumference that we see around beetle exit holes. Here is the comparison, right? These are woodpecker foraging holes. And you see how irregular the circumference is around these holes. This is just because the woodpeckers use its bill as a chisel to go after the grubs inside. And sometimes if you look really closely, you can even see these little teardrop marks. I think there's some down here and here. Those are the woodpecker's claws as it grips tightly into the soft wood as it's chiseling in there. So this is signs of wildlife using a tree. So when I see this on a tree, if that tree is in the right location, I'm going to be advocating that no one remove that tree. All right, so, the general goal is to retain trees in all their successional stages when possible. So on that first slide I showed you when trees start to decline and how they fall apart and fall to the ground. Well, ideally, we would want trees in all those conditions, living and healthy trees, as well as trees in all those successional stages of decay. When a tree first starts to die, we call it a hard snag. And we usually say that because it has most of its bark still intact. You can see this tree has been managed to retain for wildlife. The top has been cut and the branches have been reduced to leave them as perches. And they've obviously decided this tree's root system is pretty secure. So this is a hard snag. This, by comparison, is what we call a soft snag. And it is still very valuable to wildlife. Where cavity nesting birds are concerned, woodpeckers would not excavate in here because there's no bark to protect its cavity. Now, some secondary cavity nesters might take advantage of cavities in a soft snag, but it's a little more risky because their nest site would be more inclined to be more open to predation. But still great habitat value if you can keep a soft snag. The only caveat I would say is if this soft snag cannot safely fall in place, it would be important to remove it before it gets quite to this point of decay, because a tree care provider cannot climb a soft snag. They'd have to bring in big equipment. So you have to keep in mind that soft snags, if they're retained, should be retained probably only in places where they can naturally fall in place. Otherwise, you have to remove them sooner than later. All right, so here are some opportunities for places where it might be more appropriate to retain a dead tree in developed areas. So I always say, well, habitat quality really matters when we think about saving dead trees. Obviously, we wanted to save dead trees in habitats that are a lot of value for wildlife, right? So lots of mature trees, different species of trees, lots of lower vegetation, lots of structural diversity in the habitat, some maybe even some grass or turf. Really, this is really good quality habitat. The one picture on the left, as is natural areas. This is obviously not aerial, things are a little bit more arid looking, but natural areas would likely be many more native trees and plants here. So these are really good places to advocate for dead trees. In addition, what my habit is that when I want to go looking for dead trees in high habitat areas, I know there's great resistance here in California retaining dead trees, particularly in places where people recreate. So this is a park. And so I went walking this park, or I walked the perimeter, because I know that the rangers are much more inclined to say yes to me, we'll leave that tree there, if it's around the perimeter where there are no walking trails and people are much less likely to be, no picnic benches or little picnic shelters and so on nearby. So they retain about 4 or 5 dead trees for me around this, around the perimeter of this park. So property perimeters are good, safer places to retain dead trees. Then I would always say, oh my gosh, the riparian areas are among the most valuable of habitats. There are places that almost all wildlife associate with at some point if they can. And so dead trees saved in riparian areas or anywhere near as like any body of water, particularly valuable. I also want to point out, you probably have some power lines still above the ground. We do, many of us now have power lines under the ground as well. But, tree care providers obviously have to abide by the laws, the regulations in terms of clearance from power lines. So they have to do sometimes some serious reduction of tree height. And in some cases, their management of these trees is so aggressive that it eventually compromises the tree health and the trees eventually die. I was really, really pleased to see that this one conduction company who hired these arborists, reduced the height of this dead tree, but didn't take it away. They left it, and they probably did because these trees are in a more natural area. But these are great opportunities when work kills a tree. If that tree is in a good place to stay standing, save that tree rather than remove it, right? And of course, in private properties that are big enough, you can retain a dead tree in your yard. This one, of course, on the right here actually shows a stump. This tree looks like it's broken off. Or you could even have a tree higher than this, a stump higher than this. Obviously, the homeowner doesn't have to worry about a lot of human traffic, can monitor that tree, right? And this is great habitat, this backyard. There is turf, there is lower vegetation here for cover. There are many mature trees in the yard as well as in the neighborhood, tree species diversity. This is a cool habitat, private property. So always that opportunity. I would also say that habitat edges, that is where one type of habitat abuts another type of habitat. I don't know, I'm assuming this is a meadow here, that this with forest or woodland opened up on a meadow, so we consider that a habitat edge. Really helpful to have dead trees here, because there are some birds that will nest in one habitat, but forage in the adjacent habitat. So where you have dead trees at these junctures, really, really helpful. Also, when dead trees are retained in hedgerows or places where they are buffered by living healthy trees, really good for 2 reasons. One is that wind the dead trees will protect the living trees will protect the dead trees from falling over for some time. And also, if cavity nesting birds are nesting in that stump, when the birds fledge, they have immediately cover to go to. So the general rule of thumb is leave as much as you can and as much as aesthetics allows. Obviously, some habitats like cemeteries and botanical gardens and certain parks or whatever, or golf courses where aesthetics is important, you might not get them to cooperate so much. So aesthetics, because they don't like the look of the dead tree. Although on the perimeters, you might get them to. So the general rule of thumb is pick the biggest tree you can to retain and leave as much of it in place, as much as safety allows. So as a general rule, I say, go for trees that are 12 inches in diameter or more and leave preferably at least 15 feet high. But I'm going to contradict myself in a little bit in a couple slides down the line. But you can see here where the tree care providers shorten the tree and reduce the limbs, right? To take the weight off and to reduce the risk that limbs would fail. This is in a very high habitat park, that's sort of the perimeter. And I would say, if you could talk the tree care provider into making coronet cuts, this is a hard snag right here on the right, a tree just dying. Whoops. Click that again. Making coronet cuts at the tops of trees, dead trees, or at the ends of their limbs will allow water and bacteria and fungal spores and pathogens to get in to hasten the decline of the tree. This is helpful if you have a hard tree or a tree that might take a while to decay inside. I also, because you live in areas where you would get snow, I also plug this photo in for you because I remember an arborist telling me, Gillian, in areas where there's a lot of snow, if you have a dead tree, a lot of snow can weight brittle branches down and can cause branch failure. So be sure to alert people to the fact that, if that tree is in a place where it might be laden with snow and a limb could fall on somebody or something, be sure to maybe trim those branches a little shorter. Be aware of that risk. All right. And to me, one of the best compromises in urban areas is to save dead limbs in living trees, right? Many times property owners or rangers or whatever are less concerned about saving a dead limb than they are saving an entire tree. So the goal then again is to leave the limb as long as you can leave it, but shorten it as much as you have to for safety. When a limb is 4 inches in diameter, it is large enough to accommodate a downy woodpecker and therefore other secondary cavity nesters. But even if it's not, the limb is not even 4 inches in diameter, but a smaller limb, it's still going to have insect prey for wildlife, right? So, and be aware that you would just want to leave as much as you can because you may already know this. Woodpeckers just don't make a cavity behind the entrance hole, they dig down, right? And it varies how deep they dig, anywhere between 10 and 15 inches, but you see what the inside of a woodpecker cavity looks like, right? So you want to leave as much as you can in those limbs. All right, so here's where I'm going to contradict what I said a little earlier. Normally I would, I said it would leave us about 15 feet is ideal. Well, look at examples here. So on the picture on the far left, there's a tree stump. It is in a big, busy parking lot. When I took this picture, there were 2 cavity nesting birds nesting in that stump, a mountain bluebird and a Williamson sapsucker. But that trunk had holes all around it. Now, normally I would never say leave a dead tree in a parking lot, but remember I said location really matters. So look in the background of that picture, there's a forest there, right? So the stump is safely in place. That stump's not going anywhere. It allows the birds to nest there, but forage in the forest. So never underestimate the value of a short stump. And the middle picture shows that too. This little stump I found in a little abandoned field, it was no taller than I am, and I'm 5'3". And at the tippy top was a hole. It was 3 feet, 3 or 4 feet off the ground, this thing, well, maybe 5 feet. And the downy woodpecker was nesting in there. Who would think to leave a little measly stump like that? But always dead wood, I tell you, never underestimate the value. And on this picture on the right, I don't know much about the context because I didn't take that picture, but clearly a dead tree was removed, right? You can see here in the center, there was heartwood rot. Here is a mountain chickadee, a bill full of insects. Now, I don't know if it was just finding insects inside that tree or if it was nesting there, but clearly that was habitat for that chickadee. So, and there are birds that forage close to the ground and they love perches just elevated a little bit off the ground to hunt for flying insects. near to the ground, or for insects on the ground. The American kestrel is one that does that. You can find it on a stump very often, looking for lizards and other insects on the ground. So don't ever underestimate the habitat value of a short stump. So there is the opportunity for you to recruit a tree to be a dead tree, a snag. So I would say consider recruiting a snag in places where the canopy is a little too dense and you want to cull a tree or two to allow maybe some light to come in or to allow the others there to do better, less competition. Or if you want to kill an invasive tree species, if that's your objective, you can recruit a dead tree. So there are different ways to do that. These are illustrations that I was given permission to use. So here, there's obviously pines of some kind, right? So here they chopped the top of the tree off. They made a jagged cut here. And you notice they then reduced the limbs. About 25% of the limbs were reduced in this tree, and they made jagged cuts at the end. So this tree is still kind of living, but you see how all the jagged cuts are going to allow water and bacteria and pathogens to get in there to hasten the decline of that tree. Then the other option is to reduce the height of the tree significantly, maybe by half, make that coronet cut, also reduce the limbs, and that will decay in time and maybe less of a risk of failure initially anyway. And here they left the bottom half of the tree completely intact. You notice they didn't remove any limbs, but they girdled the tree here. That means they removed the bark, bits of bark all the way around to kill the tree, right? Then they removed some limbs at the top and shorten it. So in time, this is what's going to die first and fall off. Then eventually, this, of course, will die. So but I always say, if you want to girdle a tree, be sure that if that top falls, it's safe for it to fall where it is. All right, and we're getting to the end now. So if you have a dead tree and a hard snag and you want to hasten decay, you can take a drill. We've used a 1-inch drill bit before to drill holes in the bark, make a jagged cut, at a limb there to allow decay to occur and allow birds to nest in there. If you have a dead tree with exposed decay, you might want to put a piece of wood over there to create some shelter in that space. Even the house wren will nest in there. And if you have a stump that's all hollowed out and you want to create some more shelter or protection from wildlife that are hiding in there, you can put a piece of wood across. So lots of things you can do to enhance habitat. And you guys made this case to me before we started the presentation about the importance of tree signs. Cavity conservation obviously has 2 signs. This is the larger one on the left, we have a smaller one, very inexpensive. But an arborist friend of mine also has a wonderful tree sign. He did his own illustration. It has a little bit more text explanation, a little bit more expensive than mine, but excellent. And you can access those signs by going to www.arboriculture.international. So consciousness raising is always irreversible, isn't it? You change a person's mind forever about a dead tree when you provide a sign. The last handout I wanted to mention that I made available to you today, I don't know if you probably know about the Arbor Day Foundation and the fact that they provide these wonderful resources called Tree City Bulletins. Well, I collaborated with them to produce this one. It's called Trees Are for the Birds or Should Be. And in here are wonderful tips for gardeners. And there's quite a bit of talk here about dead trees. So it's free for you to print out or share with others as you will. Lovely, lovely resource. And this book, I don't know if you know of them. I'm sure you know of a lot of books for native gardening and so on. This is the Humane Gardener. I only know about it because the author interviewed me to ask about dead trees, which she put a little component in there about it. So I'm just advocating her book and her website. I don't get any kickback from doing that. I just think it's a wonderful book, and her website is just really lovely, thehumanegardener.com. Yeah. So, oops, my computer is really sensitive here. So in summary, dead trees offer ecological benefits a healthy tree cannot. They enhance forest diversity because of all the organisms that can use that habitat because that dead tree is there. Organisms associated with dead trees play important ecological roles. Safety is a priority. Always safety must come first. And a tree risk assessment qualified arborist should be consulted when appropriate. Right tree, right place applies to converting hazardous trees into habitat trees. Always ask if the tree needs to be removed completely. And sometimes dead trees need to be regularly monitored for safety. And our website, cavityconservation.com, has many more resources for you. And I encourage you to share what you learned today. And yeah, so there's our website. All right. How did I do on time? Well, okay, so we're right. I guess we're okay, huh?
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm sure people have some questions. John, are you in charge of doing the chat questions?
Well, that's a good question.
This is, we aren't really experienced with doing this.
Yes,
I'm
Yeah,
looking.
I just want to say I learned so much. I thought, I had looked at the website and everything. I thought I had learned a lot of the big ideas, but you provided so many more ideas that it's really exciting.
I'm so glad.
It's just amazing how we've overlooked this issue for so long. It's really interesting. Now let's see, here's a chat.
I only see one question
Okay.
in the chat. Are woodpecker holes a sign that a tree is dying?
Well, woodpeckers do, some woodpeckers do forage in live trees, so not necessarily. So you have to sort of assess the condition of the tree, but yeah, I mean, there, like the aspen, the wood is very soft, right? So the birds will excavate an aspen quite readily and get to the heartwood. Some heartwood rot inside. So usually the answer is yes, there's probably some decay inside, but from the exterior, the tree may not appear to be dying.
A similar question, are seeing ants a sign that a tree is dying?
Oh, I cannot be sure about that. I know I often see ants, in great volumes in dead trees, but I see ants in living trees too. So I don't think it's necessarily so that the ants will only go to dead trees.
I would say, with respect to the handouts, we have the handouts. And I imagine in the next newsletter, Janet will tell people how they can get a copy of the handout. Or Janet, what's...
I'm going to put them in the learn section of our HGCNY website, but I also will put a link in the next newsletter, but they aren't there just yet because we've been kind of without internet till today. So I will be putting those in there in the learn section and also in the next newsletter so that you'll have those available. And now someone I see mentioned that they didn't see a question button. I think if you put your question in the chat, John, is that where?
That's where I was looking for questions.
Yeah. I think it was Kate. Just put your question in chat.
Or just unmute and ask.
Oh yeah, you can unmute and say your question. Jill is asking, is there federal support for, oh, I see over here, okay. For turning invasive species into snags? Yeah, that's a good way of getting rid of invasive species. I don't know if there's any federal, Gillian, do you know if there's any?
I don't know of any official support for them, but the arboriculture industry certainly would support it, because the goal is to protect the health of our trees, and so stop invasive species because they can be destructive and of course compromise the quality of habitats. So yeah, I don't know anybody would. Well, some people love certain species that are invasive, and even some of the invasive species have some habitat benefit, believe it or not. They're producing fruits or something that the wildlife like. So, it's always a balance, isn't it, to decide what benefit the tree provides, even if it's invasive, and whether or not, you can tolerate it in that place, or what your priorities are. If the land is yours, you can do with what you want, right? But I don't think the federal government necessarily has taken, at least I'm not aware they've taken any position about this.
Yeah.
Gillian, I have a question. You know, I have to cut down an oak tree and I was going to leave a snag. I already have a lot of woodpeckers around my house and they like to peck on my house a lot. Yeah, I have cedar shakes. So, you know, I don't want to leave a snag that would encourage them to also, because it would be right next to my house, to possibly continue that process on my house. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Is that a realistic worry?
Well, yes, of course, the more if they're already, you know, making holes in your house, and the more you attract, give them reason to come, the greater your risk their sighting is, for sure. You could cut it down and leave some logs down on the ground.
Diana, do you know if they're making holes? Because what Jim said is that they may just be tapping on your cedar shakes to communicate.
Oh, no, they're making holes.
Oh, okay.
They made holes one year that another bird nested in.
Yeah, they will do that. Yeah.
I'd like to chime in on this because I have exactly the same situation. I have a cedar shake house. I have a Norway maple in my backyard that I just took down, well, made it into a snag. Diana, I had sent you information about it, or Gillian rather, I had sent you information about it and I was gonna send you a picture. But woodpeckers put a hole in my cedar shakes. I plugged it up. They put a hole back in the cedar shakes. I hung a CD so that it would make some flashing noises. They got around that. I finally came to a detente with the woodpeckers. So the hole is there. They're not making any additional holes. And sometimes they sit in there and I poke my head out the window and I look at them and say hi. And they haven't made any other holes. So it's kind of like I've made an agreement with them. Now I'll be interested to see whether or not my Norway maple snag will attract them at all. But it has lowered my blood pressure a lot because the tapping on my wall used to just drive me nuts.
Oh, I bet.
They don't anymore. They haven't made any other holes. So I don't know what that means. That's just my personal experience.
Oh, that's very, would you be kind enough to send me pictures of your holes?
Yes, I absolutely will. I absolutely will.
I don't have a picture of a hole in a house, so I would love that. Yes. Oh, they can be real pests. Yeah. Well, you know, and woodpeckers do reuse their holes, their cavities sometimes, but more often than not, they make a new cavity every year. Sometimes they make more than one, because woodpeckers in the perfect world prefer to have more than one cavity in case the first cavity is predated. They have another one to start nesting in immediately. And also because the males, as a general rule, tend to stay with the young at night, and the females roost elsewhere in another cavity. So you're very lucky that they haven't.
I think you may have put your finger on the difference here. I have a large fir tree that has a lot of cavities in it. They apparently also put a hole in my house, but they have used that hole multiple years, or some, maybe the same birds, maybe not the same birds. They're not making a new hole, but they're coming back to that hole and using it. So
do you know what woodpecker that is that you have using?
You have one, you had a picture of them on one of your slides. It was the little black and white spotted one.
Oh, probably the downy.
I think so.
Yeah, black and white, yeah. Reusing, when I hear a woodpecker reusing a cavity, I immediately think of the northern flicker. In your case, the yellow shafted flicker. Because they are the weakest excavators of all the woodpeckers, and so they are known to reuse cavities. But the downy,
yeah, I don't think it was a flicker because that looked very different to me in the photo that you had. Yeah.
Wow, that's really cool information for me to have. Wow, I love
I'll send it all to you.
Write me with your stories anytime. I love to learn from you. Yes.
I noticed someone wants to know the URL of your website, cavityconservation.com.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'll put that link with the PDF files also, and also in the next newsletter, so everybody can go to that website.
Sure, and give anybody my email address, Gillian.martin.cavityconservation.com, and send me pictures, send me your stories. I learn from people like you, so send it my way.
Okay, great.
There's
Yeah.
one more, I see another question, and I'm not sure who it's addressed to. Do you have carpenter bees in the siding? And this may be addressed to the people who have holes.
I don't have any. No.
I had a few and then they went away. Carpenter bees do not bother me. I let them do what they do.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were saying carpenter ants. Yes, I have carpenter bees. Yeah.
Interesting.
In the soffits of my house.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Let me say this to Gillian, read some of the other things in chat are great presentation, excellent topic and presentation, great presentation. This has given me ideas of what to do with a large section of a pear tree that has come down. Thank you, great presentation. I learned, someone else, I learned so much today. So
Oh,
you
you
have
warm
been
our
well
heart.
received.
Thank you so much. It's just been a pleasure being with you. I know we are kindred spirits because our goals are the same. So thank you so much, and just share your enthusiasm wherever you go.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us from the
My
other side of the
pleasure.
country. And this is one of the side benefits, or one of the few benefits of the changed world with the, yes.
Yeah, oh,
Yes.
absolutely. It's been wonderful
So,
for me too.
Yeah. So thank you all for showing up, and we have recorded it. So I'm going to be looking at some of this again. I mean, there's just so much that I'd really like to review it all. So I'm really happy to that we've recorded it and, share it with other people. The more people who understand this, the less likely people will be to look askance at people leaving something that's when people take trees down in our area, the stump grinder is there the next day so that it's just completely obliterated. So, I think the more knowledge, the better. So thank you for helping us learn about this today.
My pleasure. Thank you
Yeah.
for the opportunity. Happy
Yeah.
Thanksgiving.
Yeah,
Everyone.
you too.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.